It's a Saturday morning, and we are getting ready to route out the truss rod cavity for the neck. So I've gotten set up here. So I made this jig a while back. It's clamped down there. I've got a piece of wood underneath there, and then I got the neck on top. So I drew out all the lines. I drew out the center line. I drew out the truss rod line to give me a good guide. These bars right there and right there keep the router straight. So I've also drilled some holes. The only one that really matters is underneath where the router's at, so that the bit can have a place to start. So everything is held down by masking tape and super glue, and we're just going to turn on the router and start going and slowly make passes. We have to be very careful. We don't want to go too far over there. We can always chisel out more if we don't go far enough. So let's get started. One thing I should have done was put a stop somewhere back towards the end here. That way I would not have any danger of going over where I wanted to end. I did go over just slightly. I caught myself in time, but it's always good to have another, uh, I guess, added layer of protection, so to speak, so that you can't physically go any further with the router. Everything looks good here. I did a little bit of freehand up at the front, right in there. I did that just to make it a little bit easier to chisel out. it looks like we have the depth that we need. I was kind of checking it as I went. I'd rather it be a little too shallow than going too deep. So it looks like we're right about where we want it. If we need to go another pass, we can always do that. But right now, it's looking pretty good, and we're going to chisel out the rest up front and try to make sure that this fits in there. And then once it does, we can work on the rest of the neck. So as you can see, we're almost there. I've got a little bit more chiseling to go. And once we get this to where it fits in, we'll move on. I'm not really going to record any more of the chiseling. I think you've probably seen enough of that for the neck. So we will just work on going a little bit wider so that fits in. So I ended up having to go a little bit deeper on the truss rod cavity. It was poking just a little bit over the top here, and we want it to be flush basically. So now went back through using my jig again. We carved out up here. So now you look at it on the side there, it's nice and flat. And it's a nice snug fit too. So like if we do this, I can get it out, but it's not just going to fall out there. So we have a nice snug fit, which is what we want. Now that we've got this taken care of, we're going to work on the cavity access here by drilling a hole, and that can be a very, I'm not going to say complicated, but it can be time consuming, and you have to be very careful because it's easy to tear out, it's easy to mess up this this hole for the truss rod cavity access. The other thing is that I am almost out of those two things right there, so we're going to have to go to the store and get some more. One thing with the truss rod cavity that I was not able to do on this one is if you have basically a rectangular piece of wood for your neck and your edges are straight and you have your center line, if you can, you want to put your truss rod cavity in there first. So this is angled, so this part is a lot thicker than it is down here. I have my center line and everything like that, but it's a lot harder to use a guide or to center this so that you get this in the middle where you want it to be. If you have a straight piece of wood before you cut out the neck shape, you can use like your router fence and just go straight along the side with, you know, however far in your bit needs to go, and just run it straight up a few passes. That is the safest and what I would say is the recommended method. The reason we couldn't do it with this is because of that. Because of the headstock and because I did the angle with it, we had to kind of go at an angle with my full neck template because I just didn't have wide enough wood otherwise. So I couldn't just put this down the center because this side sticks out a lot further. Now if I had a really wide piece of wood, I don't know, maybe like 5 inches or something like that, and I went straight down the center and I had plenty of room on both sides for this to extend and then the other side to extend here, we could have done it that way. But when you're working with limited materials, not all of us can just get as thick of wood as we want. We also, if we want to do different shapes and things like that, without putting wings on here, which I could have done, but then you're going to probably see a joint back there, and since the back is not being painted, ideally we don't want to joint anything that you're seeing in the headstock unless we're painting the headstock and we are only painting the front. So our goal here with the angle grinder on the neck was to remove as much material as possible. Um, if you have rasps and things like that, you can do it that way. There's a lot of different ways that you can do it. I just did that because it was the quickest, and I just made sure I didn't go too far, didn't take off too much, because we're going to use files and rasps to actually shape everything else moving forward. But we got a bunch of material out of the way, so that's going to make that job go a lot quicker. Alright, so the neck is really beginning to take shape now. We have the volute on there. It needs some more work. We need to do a little bit more rounding, a little bit more fine sanding. This particular neck we want very thin. We're not looking for like a C-shape neck. We want this to be thin and fast, which it looks like it's getting there. As I mentioned earlier, there's our joint. Looks pretty good. There you go. And that's typically how you find it in production guitars that have the neck in two pieces like this. We've thinned out the headstock. Yeah, there's what the volute's looking like. It needs a little bit more shaping, obviously more sanding and whatnot. I'm going to double check the thickness of this because we want this to be about 22 millimeters, I think is what we're aiming for with the fretboard on there. I think the last time I checked it before I finished the current sanding was 18.5. So we can thin it out a little bit more before we put the fretboard on. So it needs a little bit more shaping, some more fine sanding. We were using very low grit paper on the orbital sander. Basically, I was using it to take as much material off as I could, and you might notice I used it to shape that as well. Not completely, I used a file as well, but it did help get the shape that we were looking for right there. So the orbital sander is extremely useful when sanding a neck. So we're gonna keep on working another day from all of the filing. It's very tiring to do all that filing. So we're going to stop here and then do some of the finer tuning to the neck. And then after that we will work on the fretboard and get that ready to glue.